World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. on a sultry early autumn afternoon. Today is Friday, the 23rd of September, 2016. Welcome to the program. And remember, this is your first line of defense for the First Amendment. If you want to have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, I am your canary in the coal mine. If they take me down, then the First Amendment will be well on its way to being gutted. So I urge everybody to support this activity. And the way you can do that is go to americansystem.us, americansystem.tv. What am I saying? americansystem.tv, and subscribe to the daily version of this program. This is a weekly program here, but we do have 4 daily programs, and we hope to expand that as time and resources permit. But please go to americansystem.tv and subscribe, and you will be glad you did, because we're several days ahead of most of the news, and I can give you an example again today. Right now, though, we're in the midst of the U.S. election. Voting has already started. As far as I can see, there's early voting going on in Idaho, in South Dakota, in Minnesota, in New Hampshire, is it? Or Vermont. Iowa starts next week, and ultimately it's going to be 37 states that allow some form of early voting. North Carolina is also voting, and we have we actually have some kind of partial profiling results from those voters in North Carolina. We've also got a last-ditch attempt by the Attorney General of Texas to convince the Supreme Court that the Texas voter ID law, the one that purports to deal with voter fraud — we know there is almost no voter fraud. There's top-down vote fraud. Yeah, that we have. This law doesn't protect against that. So we're hoping that the divided court will hang tough and not allow this outrageous imposition. Remember, what you're dealing with here is the permanent austerity dictatorship, right? Republican control of the White House, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Supreme Court would then lead to a situation where unions would be completely banned, where voting would become almost impossible, the government would be privatized, and the billionaire class would be in a dictatorial position. We've also got an aid convoy which has set out from Damascus in Syria. This is not going to Aleppo, but to the town of Moadamia. Moadamia is not that far from Damascus, but that aid convoy has successfully arrived. So small progress to report, but some progress. Now, today on the National Public Radio International Hour, we had a very strange situation, and this is what you see increasingly. We had a bunch of people who did not like the Syrian ceasefire, right? They say, it was never going to go anywhere. The Syrian ceasefire is a dead duck. It's not. It still can be revived, of course. What else are you going to do? You're going to have war until the end of time. Eventually, there's going to have to be either the collapse of one of the contending parties, which might happen, and otherwise it's going to be some kind of a negotiated ceasefire. But we have all kinds of people who heap scorn on the ceasefire and then turn around and say, Obama, you should have intervened. You should have started a war. This is baloney. And the reason that Obama is sitting pretty at 58% approval of the U.S. population is precisely because he did not, repeat, not start a war, not with that chemical fakery and not with anything else. By the way, there are reports of the rebels. There's a report of ISIS using chlorine, quite possibly, a mixture of chlorine and mustard gas. But you don't hear about that. There's no big brouhaha about that because the warmonger forces want to blame something on Assad, and we're the place where this chlorine and or allegedly mustard gas was used. That can't be Assad. So here we are. The voting has started. Early voting is on, and there are still these skirmishes about whether the American people are going to get to vote. And remember, if you put the Republicans into power, they will take away your right to vote. So there'll be no First Amendment, and there will be no 14th Amendment, in effect, right, since it would be done through the states. So the fruits of the Union victory. Think of the Union dead in all those cemeteries and what they fought for and what they hoped for. And then get serious and be serious and don't listen to the siren song of Jill Stein or of this unfortunate character, Gary Johnson, who was on the television this morning making faces, sticking his tongue out and saying that if he could only get on the stage, he wouldn't have to say anything. He could have his mouth sewn shut and he'd still get 20 or 30% of the vote or whatever he thinks he would get. There's a lot of baloney. This is clowning. It's time to be sober, serious, and realize these huge stakes. Let's just look at the Syrian situation. As I say, one convoy has gotten through. The Washington Post today, reflecting Russian media, points out that the factional situation in the U.S. government is now widely known. It's an open book for the world to see. And the way that the Russian media, for example, comment on this is they try to make it look like Pentagon against State Department. It's really not. It's Pentagon defense intellectuals. It's civilians in the Department of Defense like Ashton Carter and his neocon cronies against the large part of the uniformed military and the State Department. So it's just this small group. Of course, the group also cuts across into the State Department, right? We've been talking about them. We've been talking about Ashton Carter. We've been talking about Samantha Power. And we've been talking about General Votel. And General Votel is also, we'll get to him in just a minute, his unhelpful activities have continued. However, a spokesman, and here we go back to the Washington Post, a spokesman for the Russian Defense Ministry, Major General Igor Konashenkov, has said that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, and Defense Secretary Ashton B. Carter, who both testified on Capitol Hill yesterday, Thursday, they were both, quote, expressing their personal opinions and their fear of responsibility for yet another blunder or deliberate provocation. Wow. And it's realistic. What they're talking about, of course, is the Deir ez-Zor bombing on Saturday afternoon. Let's hear what the WAPO says. Russia has seized opportunities to drive a wedge between the State Department, which negotiated the deal, and the Pentagon, which has questioned it. In a social media post on Thursday, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry now, Maria Zakharova, seized on Dunford's statement that he could not conclusively is the word from Dunford, he could not conclusively prove that Russia was responsible for the attack on the aid convoy. Isn't that interesting? And we'll get more on this growing awareness of the factions in the Obama administration. And guess where you probably heard that first? Here, several days ago. Back in a minute. Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So the world now sees, I don't think they quite get it, because Pentagon versus State Department is really not an adequate view of this, as we have pointed out. It's defense intellectuals, right? Pentagon civilians, Ashton Carter and company, plus a couple of, what can we say, State Department renegades like loopy Samantha Power and some others like this General Votel. We'll get to him in a minute. they are part of the spoilers. We've been talking about them, right? The spoilers. That's Kerry's term that he used in his speech in the Security Council. And if you'd been listening to the American system every day, then you'd be aware of that. But that's what he calls them, the spoilers. Now, this Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, after Kerry had spoken at the Security Council, she writes, quote, "The Pentagon is shooting him, Kerry, in the back." This is how stupidly and mercilessly they framed the State Department. So what did Dunford say in his testimony? He says, "We know there were 2 Russian aircraft in the area at the time. His judgment is that they struck the convoy. Sorry, General, it's wrong. There were also some other aircraft in the area that belonged to the regime at or about the same time. So I can't conclusively say it was the Russians, but it was either the Russians or the regime." No. One obvious suspect, Turkey, is just minutes away. Don't rule out Turkey, and above all, don't rule out the so-called Free Syrian Army and these treacherous characters. So you notice that when Kerry made this proposal to ground combat aircraft over the area north of Aleppo where the convoys would come, he said ground everybody. In other words, don't let any warplanes into that area. So not Russia, not Syria. Could mean also not U.S., not Turkey, not Britain, not France, not Emirates, not Saudi, and so forth. Dunford said he would not agree that the coalition aircraft ought to be grounded, but the Syrian regime aircraft and Russian aircraft should be grounded because they are the ones with the barrel bombs and so forth. But, of course, all bombs kill, not just barrel bomb. And this barrel bomb stuff is also a propaganda ploy. So right now we've had a meeting of the 22 Nations Syria Support Group or Contact Group yesterday at the UN, Thursday evening in New York. And the line from Kerry is the U.S. remains committed to negotiations. He says he's no less determined today than he was yesterday. He's even more frustrated. He wants to see a major gesture by somebody. And the United States, says Kerry, will continue to pursue every avenue of progress that we can because it's the only way to ease the suffering in Syria. If Russia comes back to us with new constructive proposals, we will listen. Well, why don't you make a constructive proposal too? And then we have the meeting of the minds, right? I assume that Lavrov, the Russian government, is investigating what went on. I'm telling you now, me, Tarpley, go to my Twitter, take a look at some pictures I have there. Just go and look. Those trucks are largely intact. This is simply not coherent with some kind of bombing attack. It's not possible. It's things that are much smaller. It's things like rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, in other words. It's maybe mortars of a smaller caliber. It's possibly a grenade launcher. It's a bunch of things like this. The trucks are largely intact. Some of them are burned, some of them are not, some of them are roughed up in other ways. But it just doesn't add up that this would have been done from above. It might be, some kind of cluster munitions. That's vaguely possible, but I don't think so. And again, I want to know what's the story with the Turkish flights. And this whole area, this Castello Road, is commanded by heights to the west of the road. To the west of the road, there is high ground occupied by these Free Syrian Army types. And they're the ones with the cui bono. They're the ones with the vested interest in making sure that this does not work. All right, so press forward on this. Don't give up. How can you give up? How can a ceasefire like that be pronounced dead when the whole world knows that it's imperative to shut down this war? In other words, if you care about those people in Aleppo, stop proposing massive bombing campaigns and the rest of this stuff. It's in bad faith. Make the ceasefire work. Find out what happened. Correct it. I say it's after those FSA people threatened the U.S. Special Forces, threatened to kill them and forced them to retreat in a humiliating way, that's already enough. That we don't want to see that anymore, right? And this happened since our last program, right? A bunch of U.S. Special Forces were caught by the Free Syrian Army. What did they do? Called them pigs, threatened to kill them, and forced them to essentially run away. That's humiliating. That's an unfriendly act. What are we paying these people for? Stop paying them. Cut them off. Let them fend for themselves. Now, interestingly on NPR this morning, we had a caller saying that the guy said his son has joined the YPG Kurds in northern Syria and that they are routinely shelled by ISIS firing from Turkish territory. We'll get to this in a minute. If Obama is paralyzed, he's paralyzed by these factions. Obama paralyzed by warring factions, Pentagon, State Department, it cuts across. So Obama must now assume presidential leadership and fire some people. And if there's an election coming, I don't care, or suitably chasten this Ashton Carter. We remain committed to the U.S.-Russian condominium, and we want Obama to hang tough. There's no U.S. military option in terms of ground troops or anything of the kind. Now, there are two other things going on which give us hope. In other words, the big imperative is to get on the world historical scoreboard with a big defeat of ISIS, rout them somewhere, somehow, and it can be done. Here's the first. The first is the news now. The Iraqi army has launched its long-awaited offensive towards Mosul. Used to be 2 million. Apparently, it's estimated about 1 million now. That's the main metropolis that ISIS controls. That's the biggest thing that ISIS still has in their so-called alleged soi-disant caliphate. So here's what's happened. The Iraqi army has made an important gain just in the first couple of days. This is called the town of Sharqat, Shirqat, Sharqat, and variations on that, on the Tigris River. And it has just been liberated. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. So the Iraqi army has liberated the town of Sharqat, Shirqat, and other variations, Sharqat. I think there's also Sharkat. You know the problem, transliterating Arabic into the Roman alphabet that we have over here. This is a strategic point. It's a neuralgic point. The Iraqi forces have essentially cut probably the main supply line up to now into Mosul. And it has really cut off the ISIS characters from doing what they want. Here, ARA News. Iraqi army forces reported new gains in the campaign against ISIS on Wednesday, recapturing a number of areas and cutting off a main ISIS-held supply route in northern Iraq. And this is the Sharqat district of the Saladin governorate. And they have been driving the ISIS people out. Villages include Al-Jazma, Qadan, Baja, and Al-Sabqa, says an officer in the Iraqi army. And this is a key supply line for Daesh, ISIS terrorists in northern Iraq. It linked Daesh held Mosul with the Sharqat district and the Baj district. Losing this route was a heavy blow to Daesh, because they can't support operations in those two districts with reinforcements anymore. So that's a plus. Can't somebody inject this into the U.S. election campaign? The U.S. election campaign is conducted in sublime, or maybe not so sublime, right? Reprehensible ignorance of what's actually happening. And it allows the Republican nominee to say, ISIS is winning, ISIS is coming, ISIS will be under your bed. It's ridiculous. They're being defeated. They are reeling. Now, fortunately also, we have a little bit of stuff seeping through from the real world. Here's the Washington Post of yesterday, Thursday, September 22nd. And what we find here, above the fold, on the front page above the fold, hallelujah, its grip on Mosul slipping, Islamic State lashes out. So the Islamic State is aware that they're about to lose Mosul. There is a resistance movement in the town. Their slogan is Mukawama. Mukawama with M-U-K-A-W-A-M-A. It means resistance, and it means resistance against this bloody dictatorship of ISIS. And the group, the underground organization fighting them, is called Kitaib al-Mosul, K-I-T-A-E-B, al-Mosul. And they are, they're doing all sorts of things. They're doing spray painting. They're putting slogans on the walls. I think with a little bit of imagination, I get the impression this could turn into an insurrection. In other words, rather than having to wait for the laborious and time-consuming process of advancing slowly, step by step towards Mosul, you might be at the point where Kitaib al-Mosul and some allies would be able to have an uprising and kick out ISIS. So we learn in this article that the ISIS people have been digging trenches. They have been continuously digging trenches. The place is now full of refugees who have been driven out of other places, such as Manbij, which was liberated about a month ago. And what's happening is that some of the ISIS people are so paranoid and so worried, right, so unsure, insecure of themselves. They're doing more and more searches, and they're executing 3 men for spray painting slogans. So bloody retribution. The United States estimates that between 3,000 and 4,500 ISIS fighters remain in Mosul. Their leadership has been decimated. Over the past 2 months, U.S.-led airstrikes have killed 12 leaders of the Islamic State in Mosul. This has disrupted the ISIS C-Cube, right? Command, control, communication. C-Cube has been disrupted. The mosques are under a reign of terror. Anybody with outside connections is now deathly afraid that they're going to be rounded up. This is especially officers left over from the Saddam Hussein army. Anybody who has that kind of a background is considered a risk, because these are the people that might decide to reverse their field, people with connections, right? A former resident said that arrests have singled out former officers who served in the military under Saddam Hussein. That would have been the Iraqi army of the Ba'ath Party. And, of course, the ISIS people are boasting, right, that their swords are eager and thirsty for the blood of all the people they're going to kill. Maybe it's possible to organize some kind of a quick coup de main, right, a putsch inside this, right? Maybe it's time for a Operation Valkyrie among those Saddam officers to overthrow this horrendous regime. Notice ISIS, right below that, ISIS attack on U.S. troops suspected to be chemical. Now, this is an attack on U.S. troops, not just people in general, U.S. troops. Page 14, the lower right-hand corner. Islamic State militants are suspected of firing a shell loaded with a chemical agent during an attack on U.S. and Iraqi troops in this area on Tuesday. So this is the mustard agent and chlorine, okay? And that's look at the difference, right? Compare that to the Ghouta incident of August, September 2013. So all of that is happening. Now, the other thing, we've got to just take a look for a minute now, not spending too long on this. Turkey. What is going to be with Turkey? Yesterday, the Washington Post has an article, Turkey and the West feel their way in a tense partnership, that the Turkish government of Erdogan is full of resentment about the fairly relaxed response of the U.S. and NATO Europe on the occasion of the July 15th attempted coup d'etat in Turkey. They're complaining they didn't get the support they wanted. U.S. officials are simply trying to manage this relationship. And there's really not a whole lot except to say there's a distrust, but that neither side has alternatives. Okay? But now, here's the thing that might change it all. What we need to look at here is the this question of arming the Kurds. Now, the U.S. has indirectly armed the Kurds, right? This is the YPG Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, the good Kurds, the ones with the women, the ones who are the best fighters, according to U.S. Military officers. The Obama administration, this is the New York Times of yesterday, 21st, Eric Schmidt. The Obama administration is weighing a military plan to directly arm Syrian Kurdish fighters combating the Islamic State, ISIS. This would be a major policy shift that could speed up the offensive against the terrorist group, but also sharply escalate tensions between Turkey and the United States because of Erdogan's obsession. So we'll get to some more details about the U.S. plan to arm these gallant Kurdish fighters in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. And remember, AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and then you can keep up day by day instead of just once a week. And it's the cost of a Frappuccino or something. So Obama has told the National Security Council staff to prepare a plan, and I think the plan exists, to directly arm Syrian Kurdish fighters, YPG, and do it directly, not through the Syrian Democratic Forces, not through this mixed group of Arab and Kurdish fighters, but directly. And the goal is, Raqqa is an Arab-populated city, the terrorist capital of Raqqa. The YPG is not going to be able to stay there. So if you want to have them make sacrifices and fight to get in there, there's got to be a benefit for them. So that is, I think, the idea. The U.S. officers think that the Syrian Kurds are their best ground partner. This would be the most effective way to assault Raqqa. The plan has been under discussion in the Central Command. This is General Votel again, whom we have learned not to trust implicitly. American commanders, here's something. American commanders feared that the timetable to capture Raqqa, liberate Raqqa, was set back after Turkey plunged into Syria with ground forces for the first time. It's true that the Turks cut a crucial ISIS supply route, but they also rolled back the Kurdish militants who were preparing to do this job on Raqqa. So this was a very mixed blessing, and the Turks don't coordinate, right? They don't listen to reason on this. As soon as it's a matter of these Kurds, then they go bonkers. Okay, General Votel asked if the recent volatile military and political situation around the Syrian-Turkish border had slowed the pace for taking Raqqa. General Votel, head of Central Command, said last week that it might have. We don't necessarily control the timeline ourselves, says General Votel. He was speaking at a security conference sponsored by the Institute for the Study of War. Hey, who's the Institute for the Study of War? It's the Kagan clan. It's run by Kim Kagan and that guy, General Keane. And, of course, we have Field Marshal Frederick Kagan at the American Enterprise Institute. And then we got Donald Kagan at Brookings. But Kim Kagan and the Institute for the Study of War, this is not reassuring. Not reassuring. I'm sorry. Not good. So that's Votel, right? And is that really the guy you want commanding this? Can't we get somebody a little bit more energetic, right? Is this guy a McClellan? I don't know. But it doesn't look good. So, again, Obama's leadership is what we need. So far the U.S. has not directly armed the Kurds. There's been a fig leaf, but soon the fig leaf would disappear. The practical goal of the plan is to equip the Syrian Kurds so that they can, after defeating the Islamic State in northern Syria, and they contributed most to the freeing of Manbij, that they would then start to go towards Raqqa, and the American Special Operations Forces have been with them. And the idea would be, right, if Turkey doesn't like this, well then Turkey should do something in good faith, right? You can treat this as a bargaining chip, I guess, although I think that the Kurds have earned something more. The bargaining chip, well, here's Erdogan, right? Turkish news outlets reported this month that Erdogan had suggested Turkey could conduct a joint operation with the United States to drive the Islamic State out of Raqqa. Dunford, flying over towards the Middle East, told some reporters that the final decision on Mosul, what we've been talking about, depends on the Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, according to Reuters. So you can get the idea. The ceasefire needs to be pursued. The Iraqi army moving towards Mosul has got to be supported. I think they want 500 U.S. special forces there. Let them be provided. And then you've got this other one, the Raqqa offensive, and some combination or some way to solve this. Turkey, although more likely the Kurds. These are, it seems to me, the strategic pieces on the board. Erdogan quipped today that the Syrian ceasefire was a stillborn baby, born dead. Clapper is still accusing Russia. He should cool it. He has no proof that he's willing to show. The U.S. is selling Boeing jets to Iran. That's fine. Airbus is also selling Boeing jets to Iran. These are all purely civilian oriented. So I think that's a pretty good rundown on the Middle East. Now let's kick over into our U.S. elections. We've got to start thinking seriously now. As I say, some people are already voting, and you have to vote seriously. So put aside your utopian visions. Put aside your wish list for singing tomorrows. Right? This is not the time for utopian plans. This is right now the politics of life and death and the need to survive, and to survive in a way that will allow a political opposition to be conducted inside this country. In other words, keep the First Amendment, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom to organize, to petition, and redress of grievances. Keep that intact. And there's only one choice, and you know what it is. It is imperative that the Republican ticket not prevail. Now, let's just remind ourselves of the stakes. Last time around, Obama won the popular vote by 3.2 million votes nationwide, right? That was the 2012 election. Obama beat Romney by 3.2 million votes, and with that, he won the Electoral College by 332 to 206 for Romney. However, if we go and look inside the states, right, since it's not done by the nationwide popular vote, as everybody I think by now knows, if we look at 4 key swing states, we will see that Obama did not win by 3.2 million, but he won by about a tenth of that. He won by about 334,000 votes. To be exact, 333,908 votes in the following array. In Florida, Obama beat Romney by 73,858 votes. 73,000 votes, Obama beats Romney. Now, that could have gone the other way. In New Hampshire, Obama beat Romney by 40,000 votes, a little bit more. In Ohio, Obama defeated Romney by 103,000 votes and some odd. And in Virginia, Obama defeated Romney by 115,000 votes, almost 116,000. So if you add this up, you will see that a shift of about 334,000 votes would have given the election to Romney. And that would have meant that in 2013, when that Guta chemical fraud, the one that Seymour Hersh has so thoroughly denounced in articles published in the London Review of Books, we would have had most likely a Middle East regional war and quite possibly a world war coming out of that fraud, right, which the Republicans were, as long as it was somebody else's responsibility, they were so happy to take it seriously. So 334,000 votes. Now, look at this Gary Johnson. Look at Gary Johnson with his Aleppo budget. His Aleppo budget for the United States to cut 20% out of our federal budget causing simply chaos. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Radio on this Friday, September 23rd, 2016. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and the issue is the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and preventing powerful forces from tampering with these cherished constitutional rights, and indeed just the ability to have some kind of a resistance, right? Some kind of a resistance, some kind of an opposition, I mean to say here, in the United States. Now, millennials, the word is that the millennials don't like the choice between Trump and Hillary. Okay, understandable. Especially, I think we can make this a little bit, help people to see it in a slightly different light, but it's understandable. But then, what are you going to go to? Gary Johnson with his Aleppo budget, which is going to destroy 20% of the U.S. federal government, and no Medicare, no Medicaid, no Obamacare, no S-chip, no nothing. Federal government completely out of business when it comes to health care. And why? What's the point? Because of the Austrian school? Because of Hayek and von Mises and these crazy people? Ideologues for rent gouging landlords? No. This is completely wrong. So you've got to be realistic. Now, we just went through Obama 2012. It's a matter of 334,000 votes. Okay, so your vote counts. If those four states had flipped into the Romney column, we probably would have had World War III in 2013, and we would not have had the, I think, very welcome ability that Obama has demonstrated is not to fall into these traps, right? Not to listen to these journalists who scorn the Syrian ceasefire, and then they turn around and blame Obama for the loss of life. Why don't you blame Saudi Arabia and Turkey for shipping those crazies in there in the first place, right? We never hear that such a large part of these fighters, of the 300 to 350 groups, are all foreign fighters. Now, let's then go back to Florida 2000, right? I know Jill Stein doesn't want to hear about this, but Bush, G.W. Bush, Florida by 537 votes. And this, of course, was because the Supreme Court, under the influence of the late Scalia, decided to stop the count. This was pardon. This was blatant. This should never be forgotten. It shows what kind of a system we have. Unfortunately, it needs to be reformed. And it can be reformed, but not with that list that the Republicans are circulating, right? Those people, they would have been all cool with Bush v. Gore. So remember, in Florida, the Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader, blithely indifferent to the fate of the world, 97,488 votes he got. There are two estimates now. If Nader had not been there, here's one estimate. that of the 97 to 98,000 Nader voters, if Nader had not been there, one half would have voted for Gore, 47%. 1/5 would have gone to G.W. Bush, 21%. And about a third, 32%, would not have voted. So that would have given the state clearly to Gore. Another cruder estimate is of the 97, 98,000 for Nader, 60% would have gone for Gore and 21% would have gone for Bush, and with that, Gore would have won. Now, is there an ironclad guarantee that Gore would not have started a war in 2003? We don't have such guarantees, or that he might have managed, he might have not have been out to lunch for all those months before 9/11, right? Osama bin Laden determined to strike in U.S., said the presidential daily briefing, and Bush, of course, did nothing. So what we have to hope is that the millennials will show a significant degree of maturity and statesmanship, in effect, right? That they will be aware of the tremendous pitfalls that surround us at this point. We're also told that the candidacies of Johnson and Stein are to some extent halfway houses. In other words, people gravitate to them, but then now as the actual vote approaches, or in some states the vote is actually upon us right now today, as of Friday. I think Minnesota, anybody in Minnesota can vote as of today. The great fear is abroad, right? The great fear is, what if the Republicans really do seize control of the entire government, and what will that mean? I'm afraid it means a very likely an authoritarian state right away, and then as time goes on, getting worse and worse. So with the great fear, though, you got to do something positive, and you've got to see something better as a perspective. Now, here's my proposal. If you look at that NBC Wall Street Journal poll, 37% of the Hillary voters are mainly concerned that she's too much of a warmonger. Now, I think her campaign would be very wise to help her to give assurances to voters, binding assurances, things that are so lapidary and categorical and clear and unmistakable that it would be extremely difficult to weasel out of them at some future time. So box her in. It's taking a village to get her elected. Right? She's not a strong candidate. But if she's getting elected by what amounts to a committee, then maybe that committee will continue to exercise influence. Right? So that, I think, is something that people should be able to do. In other words, why not have a peace movement that remains vigilant and mobilized, right? Why so much pessimism? There's also now, here's my proposal, right? My proposal to Hillary. This is not coming from Hillary. There are things similar that come from Hillary, but they're not as good as what I want. You'll remember that Senator Elizabeth Warren, a couple of years ago, proposed that for a year, I think 2013 to 2014, I think was the time frame she wanted, that student loans should be offered through the discount window of the Federal Reserve System at a rate of 0.75% for student loans. Now, unfortunately, in the meantime, that rate, the discount rate, that's the discount window. So the discount rate is not 0.75%. It's now 1%. So maybe that is, that would still be an improvement, right? And it would still keep the principle that the Federal Reserve has to be forced to serve the public interest and not just the interests of the banks. So what you could simply do is say, okay, Fed, you're going to put out $1.5 trillion worth of 0% credit, or 1% credit if we insist. You can use the discount window. And let's make it a 50-year maturity. So the interest would cease to accrue, and you could pay it off at a rate of 2% a year. And maybe once you got going with this, you could probably convince the Congress to vote that it should be forgiven, right? And that, lots and lots of categories should be forgiven. If you want to capture the attention of the millennials, make a strong proposal on the 1.5 trillion or 1.3 trillion of student loan debt, which is currently crushing the younger generation. In other words, the millennials is not, it's not your style or the music or between two ferns or any of this. It's do something about the student loan issue. Now, Trump. We'll do more on Hillary, then we'll get to Trump, and we'll be right back with this. We're going to do some programmatic stuff now here on World Crisis Radio. See you in a minute. We'll be right back. This radio, Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So this thing about Hillary as a warmonger is now very much out in the open, and I given the fact that that comes so clearly out of the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, I think that gives people a lever. In other words, it gives purchase on this, so that this Hillary could be boxed in. Now, remember also the polls are now. We have 3 serious polls that all give the same result. That Hillary is now ahead by 6 points. That would be the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, that would be the Associated Press poll, and that would be the McClatchy-Marist poll. All of them say Hillary plus 6 compared to Trump. Now, in the individual battleground states, it gets dicier, but I think that tendency is now clear. And we're headed towards the debate on Monday, the 26th. So we're getting ready for that. Now here, let's propose some stuff. It is important to raise the question of the control of the nuclear button and the control of the nuclear launch codes. We have a person who has expressed impatience with the limitations on using nuclear weapons, first use of nuclear weapons, first strike with nuclear weapons. We don't want any part of that. So it's important to maintain this question of, life and death, right? And that modern war is terrible and must be avoided. And she should learn to make that case. And that regime change is bankrupt, right? That color revolutions, just like hybrid warfare, should be banned with a good, thorough international convention. But now let's look further. What about these issues of austerity and domestic economics? These are important issues. And I would say the first thing we have to see is that Bill Clinton was way to the right of what Hillary Clinton represents today. Bill Clinton, after all, was a new Democrat. Remember this? He was a new Democrat. He served as the model for Tony Blair as New Labor. Yikes. This stuff makes me wince. But above all, there was something called the Democratic Leadership Council. Remember this. It goes way back. It goes back 30 years. In 1985, after Carter had lost in 1980 and Mondale had lost in 1984, there were people in the Democratic Party who said, let's take a sharp right turn. And let's stress, since it's the Southern strategy that is winning for the Republicans, let's have a Southern strategy for the Democrats. So this is the Democratic Leadership Council. And it was the theories came from people like Al Fromm, F-R-O-M, Will Marshall. These were people who wrote a lot of the programs for Clinton in 1992. But this is gone. The Democratic Leadership Council ceased to exist in February of 2011. And this was people like Sam Nunn, Chuck Robb, Al Gore, Bill Clinton. Right? These were the Southern Democrats, right-wing Democrats. They're just not good. But now those people are all gone. And now you've got something that has moved considerably to the left, right? We've now got the different foundations that have taken their place, right? The various ones, right? We'll name them as we go on. There's now something called the New Liberal Economics. So the centrists have been pushed aside. I guess it's called the Center for American Progress These people have now taken over those points. Now, it's significantly better, and it reflects the Bernie Sanders issues. The Bernie issues of our time are the burning issues of our time. Bernie Sanders economics has come in there. Some of the anti-Wall Street thrust of Occupy has also gotten in there. A lot of mush-headed stuff, I'm sure. But at any rate, things have changed, right? It's not just the same as it was back in the days of Fromm and Will Marshall. Now, the big problem with this stuff, of course, is the class content, right? We want reforms to be paid for by the people who caused the problems. That is to say, Wall Street, through a 1% Wall Street sales tax, through the banning of certain kinds of derivatives, and the Federal Reserve, who failed as regulators and therefore have to cough up the credit to finance a recovery. Now, Jill Stein is in La La Land, out to lunch. I think Jill Stein is acutely aware of the fact that if her party gets 5%, they're going to get significant payments, and I think they already have matching funds, and I'm sure that's of some importance. But for the rest of us, that is nothing. That is not going to work. So let's just go through some of the things, right? We have an interesting article here in Huffington, right? So we're told that there's a kind of a brain trust. The Brain Trust of Brooklyn, Jake Sullivan, Maya Harris, and Jacob Leibenluft, okay? Leibenluft. So, and then there's a bunch of academics behind that, right? Laura D'Andrea Tyson and so forth, right? But again, these people represent, even though, they're not on the top of my list, but still, they represent a significant moving of this to the left. In other words, there's stuff here that can be worked with. Let's talk about Social Security. Now, I don't care what Trump says about Social Security. What I care is what Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, he wants to privatize Social Security. And I'm sure the White House will go along with that. So Mrs. Clinton is very categorical. Now, we're reading here from her website. We're reading here from about 60 policy papers that she has come up with, which I think millennials really ought to look at, right, before you make the leap into the dark. Hillary Clinton, very adamant, there will be no privatization of Social Security. She will defend Social Security against Republican attacks. Does that mean something? Are we only concerned with foreign policy? Or are we also concerned with, the terrible consequences of austerity policy, genocidal austerity, as I've often called it, on the American people, right? Don't we care about that? So if Clinton says no privatization of Social Security, no tampering with the cost of living allowances, right? The COLA, cost of living allowance, the chained consumer price index, no to that. No putting of Social Security into the stock market where it's going to be lost in a panic and the brokers are going to take all the money as commissions. I think that means something. I think that gives you something to work with. It's certainly better than somebody where, it's going to be the Cole Porter doctrine of anything goes. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Let's just go further through some of this material on the Hillary Clinton economic program to see if there's anything there that might be the basis for having a future here. Concerning Social Security, this again is very explicit. There have to be expanded benefits, no cuts. No privatization, no chain CPI, no stock market investments, which shift the risk to you with your silly individual accounts. But expanded benefits for widows and other dependents, and tax income above the current cap. In other words, don't let wage income above the $103,000 or whatever it is escape taxation, but tax at least some of it. Important. Hillary Clinton has a plan for debt-free college. Well, I've given you my plan for dealing with the existing debt. This is called the New College Compact. People who have worked on it are obviously enthusiastic. They say it's like the Morrill Act. It's like the Homestead Act of 1862, where you'd get a piece of land, or it's like the GI Bill of Rights, where you'd get, college, home mortgage, and other aid. The weekend that this was put forward, it was completely drowned out by, guess what? Megyn Kelly and the Republican current nominee attacking Megyn Kelly. How about Obamacare, right? We know that Aetna has been retaliating against Obamacare because they were denied their antitrust clearance on merging with Humana. We know that Pfizer tried to do that inversion where they would leave the country. Obama seems to have stopped it. But the notion is that if Aetna pulls out, that means 1 million people can't keep their policy. Hey, you know the big Republican issue that you get to keep your policy? They said, Obama promised us we could keep our policy. Well, if Aetna pulls out, then you don't get to keep your policy, the new one you've got. How come the Republicans don't seem to have anything to say about Aetna pulling out? They applaud it, right? They say, sabotage Obamacare any way you want. This is about their speed. So, of course, this is totally unacceptable. The estimate today from the Commonwealth Fund is that if the Republican ticket does what they say they want to do, which is to repeal Obamacare, right? Repeal and replace. The repeal part is clear enough, but the replacement is anybody's guess. The estimate from the Commonwealth Fund is that 20 million people will lose their health care. Right now, we've got 25 million people with no health care, and if Trump-Pence go through with their repeal, that will rise to almost 45 million. So 20 million more people with no health insurance. With Hillary's program, the same study says that 9 million people will get health care who currently don't have it. And even the Republican Holtz Eakin from the Bush years agrees with that. So with Hillary, we would be down to 16 million uninsured, still a lot. And here's the other thing, the public option. Clinton is now, she has now promised to provide what everybody, which many people wanted during the debate about the Obamacare Affordable Care Act, a public option. So that if Aetna says, I'm not going to insure you anymore, you'll have an economical, reasonably priced, decent coverage program provided by the federal government. And you can see then if everybody then leaves the private insurance companies and goes for the public option, then that's going to be a way to essentially retrospectively fix all the things that are wrong with Obamacare, right? In other words, it's over-reliance on private companies. A couple of more stuff. The Clinton program, no more than 10% of your family income from childcare, for childcare, right? Now, there is this Trump program. We've been trying to explain how inadequate that is. The Trump one is based on deductions, which work. That all works very well for the rich. In other words, it's so tailored for the rich that it's some people have described it almost as a parody. But 10% is the top amount you're going to have to spend on child care. Is that worth something? I think it is. For infrastructure, paid leave, right? You're going to get paid leave. Remember, Clinton in 1993 got through the Family and Medical Leave Act, unpaid leave. So now, 25 years later almost, it's going to be paid leave. Good. Thank God. Some progress under the sun. Infrastructure. The Clinton figure is now up to $500 billion. Now, that's 1/10 of what we would represent, but still, once it gets going, maybe some, momentum can be built up. So $500 billion for infrastructure, and she has this $25 billion public-private bank. Well, that will be a laboratory, right? If it works, fine. I doubt it. But if it doesn't work, then that will be a signal to go on with other things. She wants to stop the currency manipulation by China. And this was back in 2011, before Trump came on the scene. Then also there's a whole segment on justice and better treatment for marginal groups. Let that be less draconian. Here, if any part of the federal government is allowed to bargain and haggle with the big drug companies, I think it is that the Veterans Administration and Medicaid are allowed to negotiate, haggle, and thereby reduce the price using quantity buying. Medicare is not. So the pledge here is to reduce drug prices by getting Medicare down to the levels, of course, because Medicare buys the most of anybody. This would allow then the prices to be lowered, right? This would save tremendous money on Medicare, reduce the strain on Medicare, and keep Medicare healthier. So again, these are pragmatic orientations towards the Bernie Sanders voters and their issues. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff on the issues has been drowned out by the incendiary statements of you-know-who. So you can see what the problem is. Let's just try to give a quick overview on this. Let's this cell essentially in a small room in Brooklyn. There are any number of people who say this is the untold story of the election is how, in a sense, radical some of this Hillary stuff has gotten under the influence of Bernie and the need to get something going with the millennials. Minimum wage. For minimum wage, she has $12, but other places can go higher. And I think, 15 everywhere is better, but even there is also a case that for some states that the 12 would be tremendous progress, and then it could then be raised to 15, right, rather than doing it all in one fell swoop. Here we go. So 7 categories of Hillary's first term. On the economy, $500 billion for public works, half funded by private investors, right? That's the infrastructure bank. Raise the minimum wage to $12, capital gains taxes adjusted against speculation, and enforce labor and consumer regulations. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. $5 trillion for infrastructure, 30 million new productive jobs paid for by the Federal Reserve. But this at least $250 billion of government spending from the Treasury, right, which I think is not the most efficient way. That's at least what Hillary Clinton has in this program. She's got special things for the handicapped. 12 weeks. Trump has 6 weeks only for the woman. This is 12 weeks for husband, wife, whoever it is, to care for a baby or a relative, or so you can recover from a serious illness. Tax credits and subsidies to ensure that no family spends more than 10% of income on child care. Matching funds for states that create preschool programs, right? Pre-K. Seed money for states that allow seed money for increasing the pay to child care providers. Education, a federal state program that would allow anybody to study at a 4-year public college debt-free. Now, that's not free, which I prefer, but it's at least debt-free. Free community college, that's free. Community college for free. A 90-day moratorium for student loan borrowers so that they can find options for debt relief. Well, my debt relief is through the Federal Reserve, once again, at 0%. Criminal justice. Cut mandatory sentences in half for nonviolent drug offenses. At least it's not the whole thing, but it's a first step. Change the definition of cases that require mandatory sentences so that they can be There can be fewer of them. And healthcare, fix Obamacare, which is there's a statistical defect in it, which it makes it in some cases too expensive for low income families. More aid, more financial assistance for people and families with private insurance who face excessive premiums. Here, demand that drug companies give Medicare the same discounts they give Medicaid. Allow imports of expensive drugs. If you can get it cheaper in Canada, get it, or Europe, or their generic equivalents. So import them from where they're cheaper. Now, the financial reform part, I think, is the weakest part. Not a surprise. But here, even so, impose a tax on certain transactions to discourage high-speed traders. Well, that's some kind of a Wall Street sales tax, and you know what they say about taxes, right? Once you pass a tax, it's going to be expanding in future years. And then immigration, comprehensive immigration reform that would allow undocumented immigrants to work legally if they pay taxes, pass a background check, and a path to citizenship. Close all private detention facilities. No more private prisons. Relief from deportation. The dreamers should stay. The parents of the dreamers should stay. Through executive action, if necessary, better legal representation for children caught up in deportation, and allow women and children seeking asylum to stay with relatives. So I think some of that is significant. Again, it's not the answer. This is not my program, but now realistically, what's it going to be? You want to have 12 million people deported? You want to have the knock on the door in the middle of the night? You want to have the cattle cars and the box cars waiting? Do you want all that? I don't want that. I don't want to see holding pens on street corners and things of that sort. I think that would be chaos. That would be the end of the United States as many of us have known it. So, again, I urge you, don't listen to that double talk from the Green Party about the lesser evil and the greater good. Forget that. You're down to two choices. And don't blame me if you're down to two choices. Right? That's not the two choices I wanted. I tried to give Bernie Sanders ways to prevail. But unfortunately, he decided not to take those very obvious paths. So this is where we are now. And I encourage people to look at the world with clear-eyed realism. Do not be carried away by your hatred of anybody. The burden of Christianity, the message of Christianity is don't hate. And as I've always then added, right? Even Richard Nixon finally realized this as he was leaving the White House, saying when you start to hate people, then you destroy yourself. So don't do it. It's time to look at the alternatives and take rational action, right? The two alternatives are both profoundly disappointing. Well, they're both disappointing. One of them much more so than the other, as I've been trying to explain, right? Here there are positive features. As a matter of fact, there are enough positive features so that we can't be sure that it's that it would ever get through. Now, let me just point out, we had the Republican nominee giving his pro-energy speech, here in Pennsylvania. So we hear all about fracking and all about coal, but notice there's nothing about nuclear. The countries that are making progress in this world, right, from China to Russia to India to Europe to all over the world, they're going with nuclear, modern, high temperature, super safe, pebble bed, fourth generation nuclear reactors in some cases. And then there's thermonuclear fusion power. In other words, the ITER project, right, which is being built in the south of France. Where's the stuff about the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, which was one of the leading ones in the world? We have got to restore the United States world leadership, or at least make ourselves competitive in the area of thermonuclear fusion power, fusion energy, nuclear fusion, right? Not splitting atoms, but melding them together and producing huge amounts of energy. Now, the other thing going on, just have to be aware of this. There is now a threat of a government shutdown. Believe it or not, government shutdown on the horizon. This is the Republicans, again, reneging. The Republicans, Mitch McConnell has just come up with a bill which provides no money for Flint, Michigan, so people can drink water. This is unbelievable. So Mitch McConnell has money for Louisiana flooding, and that's fine. We want that, right? We need all of that. But we can't be discriminatory, and he's always got this stuff about Planned Parenthood and how he wants to shut down Planned Parenthood. So the end of the fiscal year is the 30th of September. The 30th of September, the fiscal year ends at midnight, and then immediately there begins the fiscal year 2017 on October 1st. So in this bill, there's $1 billion for Zika, little enough, right? Should be twice that. Senator Portman of Ohio has got grants to fight opioids. That's fine. $500 million disaster aid for Louisiana, but nothing for Flint. Ryan promises he'll do that separately. Senator Mikulski from Maryland, right now in the end of her career there in the Senate, says the Democrats reject the partisan policy riders that have been added, such as saying that the Securities and Exchange Commission is not allowed to find out the political contributions of corporations. I think that's also very wrong. So September 30th, October 1st, the Republicans again threatening a government shutdown. Johnny One Note strikes again. I actually hope they do it. Maybe people will be reminded that this is a party incapable of governing and should not be allowed near the Oval Office. So we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, remember, it's AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. See you next week.